Hello, in this video tutorial I'm going to demonstrate how to create advanced SOLIDWORKS add-in using SwEx framework. The software will convert solid bodies to surface body, preserving the parametric nature using the macro feature. Here is the final version of the add-in, and we're going to create one from scratch. And here's a quick demo. So we have a SolidWorks model with two solid bodies. I can click the convert solid to surface command, select the solid body to convert, and as a result I have a macro feature added to my feature manager tree, which is now corresponds to the surface body, which was just converted from the original solid one. This feature performs the same as any other SolidWorks feature, so I can edit the definition, select second body, and now I have two surface body instead of my solid bodies here. And feature is also parametric, so I can modify the dimension over here, and which is going to change my resulting surface feature. So you can see my lid has been extended as well. I can also suppress feature, so now you can see it is reverted to solid bodies. I can unsuppress. I can also move it across the feature tree. So for example, in this case, I'm just going to move it before the chamfer. So you can see my surface has been changed, and I can move it back. And of course, this feature could be saved inside the model, and the model could be reopened later, and the feature is going to behave in exactly the same way. We'll start by creating a new project in Visual Studio, selecting Visual Basic template. We can use a C# as well, but as part of this tutorial, we're going to use Visual Basic. Navigate to NuGet Packages and select Code Stack NuGet Packages. I will install all three frameworks, one for add-in, property manager page, and macro feature. I need to change embed interrupt types properties for all of my SolidWorks interrupts to false. Let's start by implementing our add-in. The first step, I would just rename my class and inherit the SW-add-in-x abstract class from SwEx framework. I'm just going to import the codestack.swex.addin namespace for future reference. I also need to override the onConnect function, which is going to be called when my add-in is loaded. This function is usually used to initialize resources or add some UI elements. So in this case, I'm going to create my command group. So the commands could be created via enumerators in SwEx framework. So I just need to define the enumerator and its commands. And I'm just going to call the add command group method from SwEx add-in. I will need to pass the commands as a generic type. So a framework will take care and create the commands for each of those fields in the enumeration. Add command group method expects a pointer to the function, which is going to be a handler of our button click. So I can just create a new private sub. I could make it public if I want. Just give it some name, like on button clicked. And I also need to pass a parameter of my enumerator to that function, which is going to be passed by my framework to indicate which button is actually clicked. Even though I only have one command, I still going to use the select case to browse my clicked button. So if I add new command in future, that could be just modified over here. I need to add few attributes to complete the registration of my add-in. So first thing, I need to make my add-in com visible. And also I would recommend to assign the permanent GUID to that rather than making this auto-generated. So it will be easier to track your add-in. And I'm going to use auto-register attribute from SwEx framework, which will take care of adding the required registries entries to make this add-in visible to SolidWorks. I will be using property manager page as a user interface for creating my feature. So I'm just going to create a new class for my property manager page. I will need to create a property manager page handler, which also needs to be registered as a COM object and should inherit property manager page handler X from SwEx framework. SwEx framework following data model driven approach to drive its components. So let me just add a data model class, which is going to be used as a data model for my property manager page, as well as a data model for my macro feature. So I'm just going to define a public property of iBody, which is going to be a pointer to my body selected by user, and at the same time my edit body from my macro feature. So I'm just going to attribute that field as selection box, so it's going to be rendered appropriately in my property manager page when it's get created by SwEx framework. I will set selection filter to be select bodies, so only bodies could be selected from my property manager page selection box. Now I will create a pointer to my property manager page, and I'll just declare the read-only variable. You can just use dim. Read-only means that it can only be initialized within the constructor, which just works for me in this case. So I need to create a variable of type property manager page X with two generic arguments. One corresponds to the handler and another corresponds to the data model. Now I define a constructor of that class, and I will need to pass a pointer to SOLIDWORKS application to model into instance of the data to be rendered in the property page. So in this case, I could predefine some values for my property page, and then later I will be able to use it when I'm editing an existing feature. I will store the values of parameters into my class level variables. So I'm going to save application, model doc, and data. As I mentioned before, you can simply use dim to declare your variable instead of read-only. Next, I'm going to create an instance of my property manager page and pass the pointer to SOLIDWORKS application and data into the constructor of the page. Next, I'm going to handle the closing event of property manager page. I can look at the definition of the delegate related to the event to know my method signature. So as you can see, in the closed event, the reason will be passed. Let's also create an event in this property page class, so it's going to notify the external class when this property manager page is being closed, and also pass all of the related data to it. So I'm going to define the delegate, and I'm going to pass pointer to model doc and to the data. Now I will declare the event in my property manager page. So it's going to be page closed event, which is of type page closed delegate. And I'm just going to raise this event from onPageClosed handler and pass all of the required data to its parameters. Lastly, I will create a public sub called show to show my property manager page. Let's now come back to my adding class and declare a variable of property page type. I'm going to initialize this variable from within the button click handler, and I'm also going to handle the property manager page closed event. So in the initializer of my property page, I'm going to pass all the required parameters, such as pointer to application, model doc, and also the data model. So in this case, I'm going to create a new instance of data model, and I'm going to create a function which is going to be called when my property manager page is closed. So I'll create the new function on page closed with the signature of the delegate I have just declared in previous step. I'm just going to add the address of this function as a handler. So let's rebuild the project to see that it's all good. Our next step is to create the class for our macro feature. So I'll create a new file. I'll call it macro feature, and this class needs to inherit macro feature X from the SwEx framework. Macro feature X has several overloads to handle different types of macro features. So in this case, I'm going to use the one which is driven by data model. So similar to property manager page, I would define the behavior of my macro feature within the data model. And in this case, I'm actually going to use exactly the same data model as I'm using for property manager page. I would recommend to have a different classes, but as part of this tutorial, I'm going to use the same one. Macro feature class provides several methods for overriding. So now I will start with overriding the onRebuild function, which is going to be called every time a macro feature gets rebuilt. This is a function which you need to use to reevaluate your macro feature and, for example, generate its geometry. I will switch to my data model now and mark that body property as parameter edit body attribute from SwEx macro feature framework. So when I declare the property as edit body parameter, that means that my macro feature is going to acquire the existing SOLIDWORKS body and will return one in its place. As our add-in is going to convert solid body to surface body, I will need to remove the original solid body and replace it with my newly generated surface one. Now I need to write the routine which is going to convert my solid body to the surface body. So the first thing, I will declare my resulting iBody object, and I'm going to get the feature data from a macro feature. I will need to get the faces from my input body. And my input body is going to be my edit body because we marked that property in data model. And as you can see, my first parameter on onRebuild function is a pointer to data model, which will be automatically handled by the framework and passed to this method. So I'm just converting my faces to iFace type from object, and I'm going to use the iModeler interface and call createSheet from faces method to create my surface body from the set of faces. Finally, I just return this body from onRebuild method, so it will be generated for my macro feature. Let's change few settings in my project. So I will make the DLL to register for comment drop, and I also set my external application to be started when I debug my add-in. Just few last steps before we can see how our macro feature works. So we're going to insert that macro feature from on page closed handler, and we're going to show the property page from the button click. So let's now hit F5 and see our add-in in action. Let's open sample model, which contains two solid bodies. We can find the convert solid to surface menu under the tools menu. When we click, the property manager page is opened. Page is asking us to select solid body to convert, so I can do that, click green tick, and as a result you can see it's now a surface body in my tree. I can hide it, I can do whatever I want, and if I scroll down there is a new feature appeared in the feature tree, and this is just a normal feature, and as you can see my solid body is actually gone because it's been acquired by macro feature. So if I do a section, you can see we have one solid body and we have one surface body, and the feature has exactly the same properties as any other feature in SOLIDWORKS. So for example, it could be rollbacked, so now you can see it's still two solid bodies back. This could be suppressed as well, unsuppressed, and can be also reordered in the tree. So I can just drag and drop, and obviously you can see there is some rebuild errors, but my surface feature now corresponds to the actual body as it was at that position in the feature tree. And as you would expect, the parametric nature of SOLIDWORKS will be preserved in the macro feature. So if I would modify the pattern over here, so I'm just going to create more instances with a smaller distance between them. So actually going to generate a bit more faces. And my macro feature will still be regenerated automatically. So you see the surface still corresponds to the latest state of my solid body. As a next step, we're going to modify our macro feature to be able to edit its definition. So for example, if I want to change the body, I want to change it from my feature tree. So the first step, I'm going to decorate my model, and I'm going to include a green tick as well as a cancel to my property manager page. I can do it very simply with page options attribute assigned to my data model. I will also need to modify the signature of my events and property manager page. So I'll need to return feature and feature data, which is currently being edited, as well as the reason why my property manager page is closed. So if it's cancelled, I don't want to generate a feature and I don't want to do any modifications. I'm going to use that property page in two places now. One from the add-in to create new feature, and one from within the macro feature to edit existing one. So for that, I'm going to create a new constructor and pass additional parameters such as feature and feature data. I'm also going to create few class level variables where I'm going to store my currently passed features and feature data, and I'm going to return it back from my onPage closed event. Now I need to change the signature of the event handler from my add-in as it has been changed. So if you see here, it now shows me an error. I'm just going to copy all of the parameters and replace them over here. I'm just going to add one extra if check to see if my page has been closed by clicking the green tick. And in this case, I'm going to create feature. Otherwise, I'm just not going to do anything. Now let's implement the property manager page logic in my macro feature class. So as a first step, I'm going to override the onEdit definition function, and this function is going to be called whenever my feature is edited in the feature manager tree. I will create a variable for feature data and we'll get it via getDefinition method of my feature. I'm going to call access selection, and this will put feature in the rollback state in my feature manager tree. It is very important to use the same pointer to the feature data to access selection, to set parameters, and to modify its definition. We can get the currently assigned parameters of this particular macro feature via getParameters method. I just need to pass the pointer to feature, feature data, and model. As we're using the same class for data model for property manager page and for macro feature, I can pass it directly to my property manager page. So let me just copy that code snippet from my add-in. I'm going to use a different overload of the constructor, as I'm going to pass a pointer to the feature and to the feature data. I will copy the handler as well, but I'm going to modify the behavior. So instead of creating the feature when my page is closed, I'm going to set parameters and I'm going to modify the definition of the feature. And if it is closed with a cancel button, I'm just going to release feature, so it's going to be rolled forward in my feature manager tree. Let's start SOLIDWORKS and check new functionality. Let's open the same model and create a feature again. So I'm selecting the solid body, clicking green tick. As usual, I have my solid body converted to surface, but now I can edit definition and I can modify the property. So let me just select different body, but click cancel. So still nothing is changed. If I come back and select new body, click green tick. So now my surface is my small body representing lead, but my bottle itself is still solid body. Let's continue and introduce more enhancement. At first, I want to allow multi-bodies to be selected and obviously to generate a multi-body surface feature. And I also want to make my property manager page to check the conditions. So if, for example, none of the bodies selected, I wanted to display the warning and not allow to close property page. To support multi-bodies, I will simply need to change my property type from iBody to list of iBodies, and framework will take care of everything. So it will make a selection box to be able to select multi-bodies, and will also assign all of the selection to that particular variable. I want to modify the look of my selection box in property page. So at first thing I want to assign some standard icon. So I'm just going to select the component icon, and I'm going to make it a little bit higher because we now support multi-bodies. So I'll just put height to be 60 pixels. And now I need to modify the routine within my rebuild function so that will support the multi-bodies. So in here I'm just going to create an array of bodies which will be equal to the size of my input array. And I'm just going to do a simple for loop and will create a new surface body for each added body from my parameters. I will also modify the return parameter. So instead of using the from body method, I'm going to use from bodies method, which will take in an array of bodies to be assigned to my macro feature. Now let's validate our data before the property manager page is closed. So I'm going to handle the closing event of my property page, which is generated before the page is actually closed. I'm just going to copy the signature of that method and just create another function called onPageClosing. I will also need to validate the data when my reason is OK, so the property page is closed by green tick. If list in my data model is either nothing or contains no element, it means that user hasn't selected anything in the property manager page. So in this case, I'm going to generate an error and I'm going to stop closing of property manager page. For that, I need to set the cancel property of arc parameter to true and specify the message and the title of my error. Let's start SOLIDWORKS and validate the changes. So I will open SOLIDWORKS, open the model, just click the command again. Now you can see I have an icon on my selection box. If I deselect the bodies and click the green tick, the property page is not closed and error is displayed. I can select two bodies as well, click green tick, and now I have two surface bodies in my feature tree. If I roll back that feature, so my solid bodies get restored. And if I can modify the definition of that feature, I could just select a single body. So now one of these bodies is surface, one is solid. As a last step, we're going to add some decoration to our buttons and macro feature. So I'm just going to add few icons to my resources. And I'm going to firstly create a custom icon for my macro feature instead of the default one. So I'm going to browse the icon directly from the resources. So I just need to specify the type of resources and the name. So in this case, it's going to be solid to surface icon. And I can also specify the custom base name for my macro feature, which is going to be used when new feature is generated. I will also assign the icon and the title to the property page. I will use an overload of page option attribute, and the first two parameters allows me to specify the icon for the property page. I'm going to use exactly the same icon as I've used for macro feature. Page title could be assigned via display name attribute. I can also assign the message to the page, so it will be easier for my users to know how this functionality behaves. I didn't like the default icon which I used for my selection box, as it represents component, not the body, and there is no body standard icon available. So I'm just going to use my own icon from PNG. So I already copied this to resources, and it is a solid body icon. Lastly, let's customize our commands in menu. So I'm going to assign the icon. So very similarly, I have assigned icons before. I can use an icon attribute. I should specify the resource type and the name of the icon. I can do the same from the commands group. I can use a title attribute to specify the user-friendly name for my command group, as well as user-friendly name for my command itself. I can also configure some additional options for my command via command item info attribute. So in this case, I want to make sure that it is available in menu toolbar, and it's only available within the part, and it also has a command tab box. It is all done, so let's start SOLIDWORKS and finally check how our add-in looks now. So let's open the model. So I can see the command now appeared in my command text box, as well as my menu has been renamed to the user-friendly name. So my icon in the selection box is changed. I can select it so I can see my macro feature. If I try to start this command from assembly, which is not supported, you can see that I cannot do that as my button is disabled. Thank you for watching this video. Please follow the links in the description for more information about SwEx framework, as well as the source code for this add-in and more examples.